Welcome, everyone. Let's start with the topic that's on everyone's mind, the looming threat of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russia has for years used cyber attacks in support of its geopolitical ambitions in Ukraine, and we've already seen cyber play a role in the current crisis. In early January, the Ukrainian government was hit with a series of wiper attacks that defaced government websites and wiped out data on some government computers. They were widely suspected, though not officially attributed as being Russian. Let's start with you, Dmitri, first. Was this attack a prelude to more aggressive Russian cyber action? And how could cyber fit into a kinetic conflict if Russia ultimately decides to launch an invasion?
Well, first of all, this was a fairly basic attack that we saw happen just a few weeks ago. So I'm not sure that this was a prelude to anything, but I think there are two basic concepts that Russia has potential to execute here. One, I think that they're going to have an overwhelming preference to actually shut down as many communications within Ukraine as possible at the time that they actually launch their ground invasion. The reason is twofold. They'll want to impact command and control for Ukrainian forces, for Ukrainian government. They want to impact the ability of the Ukrainian government to communicate with its population when the war is ongoing. And they're going to want to make sure that as little information as possible gets out of the country, videos, pictures that people may be taking about what Russia is actually doing, potentially any information about civilian casualties that are taking place. So I think that their preference may very well be to try to shut off the internet. They can do so fairly easily by targeting about a dozen internet exchange points, most of which are located within Kiev and Kharkiv. And that would basically shut off internet communications to the outside world from within Ukraine. And the other thing, of course, that they're going to do is use their extensive EW, electronic warfare capabilities, to jam satellite communications, to jam radio waves, prevent TV signals from transmitting. Cell phones, I expect to be shut off as well. So I think that's going to be their overwhelming preference. If they choose not to go that route, they can certainly use cyber in a tactical way. So one of the things that they can do, for example, is do disruptive attacks against key military objectives, military mobilization databases that the Ukrainians may use to determine how the volunteers will be sent to the front and how to call up reserves. They may go after TV stations and newspapers to both take them offline or potentially to even put out misinformation through those channels that will mislead the Ukrainian public about how the war is truly going. And then you will see some other pressure campaigns on the Ukrainian population. You may see disinformation being distributed through informal networks like WhatsApp groups. You may see potentially impact on emergency response services like police and firefighters and ambulances. So a wide variety of things that they could do if they decide to go down that path.
So, Jaak, tell us a bit about how NATO and the international community are helping Ukraine shore up its cyber defenses in order to be prepared for the sorts of potential onslaught that Dmitri just laid out.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the clarification, I don't speak on behalf of NATO. The NATO Cyber Defense Center of Excellence is a somewhat independent body, but I was in Ukraine 4 weeks ago, 20th and 21st of January, a week after they had discovered those attacks, which Dmitri mentioned. You know, it turned out it wasn't a serious cyber attack. It was rather, I'd say, information attacks. At that point, they didn't know yet exactly, but they were digging to the bottom of it. What I saw there was really encouraging, especially compared to my 2010 experience in Ukraine, where 2010 I was there right after Yanukovych was elected, and there was apathy. Nobody really cared about what was going on in politics. People were like, Now this nation is together. They are united. They know that they want to move westward with their future. They don't want to go back towards, embrace Russia and the Soviet Union-like regimes. So they were focused. There were 4 different cybersecurity agencies in different branches of governments that I met with, that they were all coordinating with each other. There was no typical, power struggle between the agencies. What are we doing as a NATO CCD CUE? We offer them a broad array of options to choose from training to participation in our exercises, conferences, and we fully understand that they are a nation at war. They might not have time for everything. They need to pick and choose what's most beneficial for them, so they can benefit from it. But I'm being selfish as well. I want to learn from them. I think that they are the most battle-scarred nation now with the cyber experts. For the last 8 years, they've been the Russian testing ground of cyber weapons, so they know what it's like to be in the receiving end. So I'd love to have their experts over and telling to our people what it's like.
Well, Rob, of course, the potential for malicious Russian cyber activity in Ukraine is not necessarily just confined to Ukraine. We know that in an escalating conflict, there might be cyber activities directed against the West, to include perhaps the United States. Tell us about how your agency, how DHS is helping to ensure that U.S. agencies and critical infrastructure are hardened or protected against any potential Russian malicious cyber activity, and then maybe also what you might be doing to help Ukraine in that regard.
Thanks, Ellen. We've been warning for months, publicly and privately, that cyber attacks could be part of a broad-based Russian effort to destabilize and invade Ukraine. And there aren't any specific credible threats to the U.S. homeland right now, but we're, of course, mindful of the potential for Russia to consider escalation in ways that may impact others beyond Ukraine. And so we have been working here at home intensively with industry, with critical infrastructure owners and operators to go shields up. And we've been doing that at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, here at the Department of Homeland Security. We've been doing that through an unprecedented number of threat briefings, guidances, and alerts to our industry partners and also to industry regulators here in the United States so that they can work directly with their industries. We issued an alert together with the F.B.I. and the NSA on the Russian threat and specific tactics that we know the Russian government to use. We're also, of course, working closely with international partners. We're doing that, of course, we've been offering support to Ukraine together with other United States government agencies to help Ukraine harden its cyber defenses. We'll continue to do so in the days ahead. That being said, significant improvements in cyber defenses don't happen in weeks or even months. So we're realistic about what we can achieve. And so we're also focused on ensuring that we have incident response capacity available to them if needed. And I just want to add as well that we have been working very closely as an administration, as a Biden administration, and also with from the Department of Homeland Security, with our allies and partners, including through NATO. Deputy National Security Advisor for Cybersecurity Ann Neuberger was recently in Warsaw, meeting with Eastern European and Baltic nations to show our commitment to common cyber defense. And we work directly at the Department of Homeland Security to directly with international CERT partners every day to share the latest cyber threat information that we have. So we are all hands on deck, working with Ukraine, working with other allies and partners, including through NATO, and preparing here at home.
Thank you. And of course, Ukraine is not a NATO member, but Deputy National Security Advisor Neuberger made clear that if there is a destabilizing cyber attack on any member really of the international community, that NATO and other members would be prepared to call it out as a violation of the norm, sort of a UN endorsed norm of responsible behavior in cyberspace. And that also raises the issue of perhaps follow-on cyber attacks against NATO members such as the United States or other Western European nations, should the West, say, impose really severe economic sanctions on Russia after an invasion. What do you think, what kind of action might that trigger from NATO? Would that trigger the Article 5 commitment to an attack against one is an attack against all? What do you think Jaak or Dmitri?
Let me try to take a stab, and Dmitri will help me out. Yeah, NATO has declared that cyber domain is part of NATO collective defense as well. But it's specified in a Wales Summit declaration that it is dealt with on case-by-case basis by the North Atlantic Committee, decided how they will handle a particular attack. So it depends on the severity of attack. Are there human casualties? What's the financial damage, etc. And very deliberately, on purpose, there are no specific lines drawn that 3 casualties, $10 million damage. That would only tempt the opposition or the adversary to test your lines. What if it's just 2 casualties? What if it's just 8 million damage? So it is vaguely defined. If it's serious consequences, then the North Atlantic Committee will debate and then decide how to handle it. Over to you, Dmitri.
One of the things that I think most people don't appreciate is the actual language of Article 5. So it certainly calls for collective defense of NATO members, and it calls on individual members to help an attack party, but to help them do very specific things, to help them to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area that NATO is responsible for. So certainly when you're talking about a kinetic invasion of a country, that means going to war and using armed force to kick out the invader. In cyber, it's less clear what that actually may mean. It may mean that you're using defensive capabilities to kick an adversary out of your network and to restore the security of that network, and may not include any offensive retaliation whatsoever. It may do so if the parties agree that that's what it takes to actually restore the security, but it doesn't have to. So what you may very well see is the NATO members, preferring not to escalate the situation with Russia, would engage in purely defensive tactics to shore up security, to do incident response, and to remediate damage from any attacks that they may have that may take place.
Turn to another major cyber concern on people's minds in the U.S. and internationally, and that is ransomware. It remains a top economic and a national security threat. And members of Congress, the Biden administration, and U.S. law enforcement agencies have said that combating ransomware attacks remain a top priority. How, Tonya, is the FBI approaching the ransomware threat? And what is it doing with its international partners to coordinate on this set of issues?
Well, if there's one thing that the FBI knows how to do, it's to work with domestic and international law enforcement partners to take down criminal enterprises, and that includes cybercriminal enterprises. So as we've been working ransomware over years, we've built relationships not only here domestically with organizations like the U.S. Secret Service, but also internationally with Europol and Eurojust and many European law enforcement partners to look at these entities and see where we can conduct joint coordinated disruptions that will not only have short-term impacts, but really the type of longer-term reduction in ransomware that we're all looking to achieve. And when we look at those organizations and how we affect those types of disruptions, we're really looking at 3 areas. The actors who are behind the attacks, which may include the developers of the ransomware itself, as well as the affiliates in the organization who actually conduct the attacks, the infrastructure that they use to carry out that activity, and the money. And that last part, of course, is especially important because this is a profit-driven enterprise. And so the more that criminals see that ransomware is profitable, the more they'll be incentivized and encouraged to conduct these attacks. I think especially joining with our European partners over the past year, we've had some notable successes, not only in infrastructure takedowns, but also arresting and extraditing some of the criminals behind this activity, as well as some notable virtual currency seizures. A lot of that is enabled by our network, not only of legal attachés stationed around the world, but attendees here may be less familiar with the fact that we have assistant legal attachés specifically focused on cyber investigations, also stationed throughout the world, mainly centered in Europe. Those have been very helpful in our support to Ukraine during this current period and in the past as well, helping to investigate malicious cyber attacks against their critical infrastructure. And they're really a linchpin in how we work with our European partners against ransomware groups as well.
You mentioned the money as a key prong. How are the gaps in the international anti-money laundering regime affecting your ability to combat ransomware? I'd like to hear from you and then anyone else who's focused on that issue.
Sure, I'll start. So as we look at the financial sector here in the United States, one of the parts of the regulatory framework that really assists law enforcement excuse me, are regulations having to do with know your customer or know your client. Information that financial sector entities are required to ask of their customers to help combat financial fraud, money laundering, et cetera. So domestically, we have great partnerships, not only with the kind of traditional financial sector, but also with the growing number of virtual asset providers or virtual currency exchanges who are growing in this space. But internationally, that kind of structure and framework is not consistent. Each country has their own requirements that exchanges have to deal with. Sometimes foreign exchanges want to be cooperative and responsive to law enforcement requests for information, but because they don't have that existing framework that provides consistency in the types of information that they're collecting about their customers, they may not even have the information on hand to provide to law enforcement, even if they do want to be cooperative. And then, of course, there would be the category of companies and countries that may not have an interest in being cooperative with law enforcement in that way. So I know that international standardization would greatly help efforts in this space, and I believe there is an international entity, the Financial Action Task Force, that's working towards that goal.
So are many of the bad guys actually going to some of these exchanges that don't cooperate or don't have clear rules and guidelines about know your customer in order to launder their money and get their cash proceeds out? Is that one of the problems?
I think we can expect that cyber criminals in particular are savvy in terms of how and where they conduct their activity.
Ellen, if I can jump in here, cryptocurrency is such a critical component of this, not just to ransomware. It's really the oxygen that fuels the ransomware epidemic because of the ability of these criminals to receive ransoms anonymously or pseudo-anonymously and get literally tens of millions of dollars in some of these cases. But also it's fueling so much of other cyber malicious activity. You certainly have drug trafficking and tax evasion and other things that are taking place because of cryptocurrency, but you also have cryptocurrency being used to purchase infrastructure in an anonymous fashion. In fact, you have seen the Russian GRU, Russian military intelligence, use Bitcoins to purchase infrastructure that they had used to infiltrate elements of our election infrastructure in the past and attack the DNC in 2016, a story that you wrote about, Ellen, back then. So it is really, really important, as Tonya has said, to enforce KYC and AML, anti-money laundering rules across the board globally, not just in the United States where that's already taken place, but everywhere else on the planet. And one of the things that we've at Silverado called upon the US government, and particularly Congress, to consider is expanding OFAC's authorities and responsibilities to start sanctioning exchanges, not just if you've seen them engaging with criminal groups and facilitating money laundering, but also if they're not complying with law enforcement demands, such as those from the F.B.I., if they're not doing KYC and AML. And I think that will have a chilling effect on the criminal ecosystem, and particularly these exchanges that may not be willfully enabling these crimes, but maybe doing so because it's cheap for them not to perform these compliance checks. The US government has enormous capacity here, and cutting off these exchanges from the global financial system would literally cripple them, as we've seen in the cases of ChatX and SUEX that the US government sanctioned back in October.
But could that actually just drive these criminals underground and have them use money mules or other forms of, ways to get their money out? What do you think?
It certainly won't solve everything, but at the end of the day, you need those exchanges if you're moving tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, as is the case with some of these criminal organizations. So these exchanges serve a critical function to facilitate these forms of cybercrime. And if you can get them to clean up their act, it will make it much, much harder, not impossible, but much, much harder for these criminals to operate.
Okay. Rob, DHS is also on the front lines of the anti-ransomware fight in the US. What's your analysis of the current state of the US's resilience against ransomware attacks? And what are your department's near and long-term priorities on ransomware?
We've known for a long time that ransomware can have a devastating impact on a victim organization. I think what we saw with what happened with Colonial Pipeline in May was that you can also have devastating cascading impacts, physical world impacts. For example, in that case where you saw half the fuel supply to the United States East Coast disrupted. And so there's just no question that ransomware is a national security issue in addition to a criminal issue. One of the very first actions that the Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, took when he took office was to order a 60-day ransomware sprint at the department, even before Colonial hit, to enhance our ability to work with critical infrastructure and operators in particular to build up their defenses against ransomware. And so we have set up a one-stop shop website of ransomware resources. We've done that together with the F.B.I. We have issued all manner of alerts, guidances, and best practices to industry that they can pick up on. And so that's a very significant part of our work. We also, as an administration, are more directly attacking at the problem to try to get at it from all angles. Tonya spoke to a lot of that critical work that the F.B.I. is doing. We're also sanctioning cryptocurrency exchanges through our diplomatic outreach to allies, and also our direct discussions with the Russian and other governments. We are taking this problem on from all angles, and it's among our very highest cybersecurity priorities. I'll also say we're working very closely with Congress to try to get incident reporting legislation enacted. That is legislation that would require critical infrastructure companies to report serious cybersecurity incidents to CISA, and including ransomware incidents. We have to know about what is happening to be able to appropriately defend this country. So that is our top legislative priority with our Congress this year.
Jaak, how is Europe looking at the ransomware issue? How much of a problem is it for you, and what are you doing about it?
Well, our center has been kind of focusing on national security, the bigger picture, and we've been dealing with ransomware as the criminal thing that we don't really look into, but it's becoming more and more a security issue. It's very hard to draw a line. Where is it the criminal gang, and where is the criminal gang on behalf of a government or government themselves doing it, and it's just scaling it up. So it is a serious threat. Europe has compared to United States. Well, we would need politicians here instead of me, So I don't think I'm going to have a satisfactory answer here. But I want to pose a theory and a question to the rest of the panelists regarding money laundering and crypto. In the 90s, world had somewhat given up on tackling money laundering. Dirty money, yes, governments made efforts, but they weren't real efforts. The 9/11 changed everything, just trying to cut down terrorist funding. The anti-money laundering became a very big and impressive effort. What would be now the event that would trigger the similar governmental effort and unanimous effort in the Western world against the cryptocurrencies and their use in, not against the cryptocurrency, but the use of cryptocurrency in funding crime, terrorism, malicious activities?
It's a great question. Throw it open.
I actually don't think it's going to be that hard. It will take some time. But the reality is that the US government has achieved unprecedented success in the last 20 years, getting every nation on the planet to accept that money laundering is a problem and that they all need to fight it, and that KYC and ML rules have to apply broadly to their financial sector. So we have seen countries like Switzerland and the Cayman Islands and these traditional sort of offshore tax havens and money laundering havens in some cases really disappear because of the pressure from the US government and the threat of getting these organizations cut off from the global financial systems really going into effect. So now that you've established that baseline where everyone agrees that we all need to fight money laundering and other forms of financial crimes, it is really all about extending that from the traditional financial system into this new Web3 DeFi crypto ecosystem that has emerged. So I don't think it's actually going to be that difficult to get countries to extend their rules and regulations in such a form and fashion. And obviously the White House and the administration are pushing hard on that. The recent summit that they had in October with 30 nations on ransomware had a critical component, a focus on this very issue and how to deal with the problem of cryptocurrency. So it will take time, but I expect that this will be solved in the coming years.
What do you think, Tonya? How do you see the international community responding to your all's efforts to get them to adopt standard rules?
I think Dmitri covered it well. I would certainly hope that we're not waiting for some sort of catalyst in the form of a catastrophic incident to be what moves us to make significant progress in this area. I'd like to think that we've learned some lessons from the 9/11 example that Jaak provided in that regard. I also think we have to be realistic about, the world that we inhabit today in terms of cryptocurrency and how money flows. And, sometimes we see kind of extreme recommendations in terms of let's outlaw virtual currency or something like that. I think we need to, kind of reject unrealistic suggestions on the margins and focus on how do we improve kind of the standards and the frameworks for the world we're in today, and also anticipate where all this is headed going forward.
So we really haven't seen another, massive sort of or high-profile attack against critical infrastructure, such as the one against Colonial Pipeline or even JBS, the meat processing company. And Rob, so do you think that the efforts at U.S.-Russia dialogue over getting Russia to try to rein in these criminal ransomware actors is having some impact? Do you think it's the F.B.I.'s actions on, disruptions and squeezing the actors in other ways is having some? What do you see as the trend, A, and B, what do you think is behind it?
So Ellen, it's true that we have not seen an incident of that magnitude in some time. It's also true that we've seen reports of Russian authorities disrupting or taking into custody certain ransomware actors. But I think we still need to watch for actions and results rather than words. Ransomware remains at unacceptable levels. We've been clear with the Russian government that we expect action and that if they will not take action, we will take action to disrupt those that would target us with ransomware. And so our work absolutely continues.
If I can add, Ellen, even though we have not seen a colonial type of attack here in the United States, we have seen them in recent weeks in Europe. There's been a German oil storage company whose operations were disrupted because of a cyber attack, a ransomware attack. There were a couple of Belgian energy companies that were hit as well. So we seem to have had the significant amount of ransomware appearing in Europe in the last few weeks, particularly targeting their energy sector.
Dmitri, you follow this area very closely. Do you think that the recent actions to arrest some of these criminal actors in Russia portends things to come, or do you think those were sort of just gestures, empty gestures or one-offs by the Russian government? And do you really think we're making forward progress or not here?
Yeah, Ellen, I've really called this action ransomware diplomacy. Russia's newly found cooperation on ransomware is not an it's not an accident that is taking place in the midst of these significant tensions over potential invasion of Ukraine and the threat of severe sanctions against the Russian economy from the West as a result. So I think they're sending a signal to us that they can indeed be very helpful on investigation of these criminal actors and arresting them, something that they have not done in the past, but they will not do so, obviously, if the relations disintegrate over Ukraine. And I do think that if there are severe sanctions that we impose on Russia in the coming weeks, we may very well see a reversal where some of these individuals would be released, and that would send an unmistakable, even unspoken message to the Russian cybercrime ecosystem that it's open season on Western organizations.
What do you think, Rob?
I think we're prepared for all contingencies. It's no secret that Russia has proven itself willing to use cyber means to achieve its broader geopolitical objectives. We've seen that in Ukraine with what it did in the 2015 timeframes with disruptions to the energy grid there and otherwise. And so we're preparing for all scenarios. We're ready for it. And that's why we're working very closely with industry, with other government agencies to protect our federal networks from being targeted. I think that's where our focus is right now, is on preparedness.
And Ellen, if I could add in there, I would just like to recommend to those watching a joint cybersecurity advisory that U.S. government agencies like the F.B.I. and CISA recently published, along with our cyber counterparts in the UK and Australia, looking at ransomware trends, not only in the US, but across all of our countries, noting some of the changes over the last year, including, particularly in the US, a move from what we refer to as big game hunting that focus on kind of high profile victims to more of the mid and small sized victims of the attacks.
So in the event of escalating conflict in Europe, in Ukraine, how concerned should we be about a really devastating and catastrophic use of cyber, either against Ukraine or against the West? Dmitri, just talk a little bit about the role of cyber in Ukraine. You unmute, please.
Sorry about that. First of all, I don't believe that Russia will be the first one to escalate in cyberspace against the West. I think if we do see major attacks against Western entities, it will be because of severe sanctions that will put in place on Russian economy as a result of invasion. So they're going to wait and see. The signals that they've been sending over the last few months have been very clear. They don't want to escalate vis-a-vis the West. They view Ukraine as their local problem, and they are very allergic to our defense of Ukraine. However, if those sanctions do take place, I think you can absolutely expect a rise in ransomware attacks against U.S. institutions, against European institutions. You may very well see even Russian state actors engaged in some cyber disruption, but I think it's probably less likely. Russia has enormous leverage in the economic sphere, even outside of cyber, to respond through export control measures, for example, on critical materials like aluminum and uranium and titanium and palladium and many other things that will do a lot to hurt the U.S. economy and the global economy and cause rise of inflation. So I don't think that cyber from state actors is going to be the first or the preferred mechanism for response. But certainly, if things continue to escalate, everything is on the table.
Okay.
I want to, first time in my life, I want to try to disagree slightly with Dmitri.
Okay.
Mr. Putin said in 2007 Munich Security Conference that he's sick and tired of the existing security architecture and he wants to change that. And he's still at it. So I don't think Ukraine is his goal.
Oh.
To get us, the allies, to fight amongst each other and disrupt our unity. So cyber is a really, really good way to do that. I can't right now come up with a example how to get nations to disagree on something, but a strong cyber attack against an ally who either is on Russian border or is very far away from Russian border and usually doesn't see Russia as a threat of a specific character, and see how nations disagree on the response, and then go from there. That could be a way to drop a seed of disagreement amongst us, the NATO allies.
Okay, in the minutes we have left, I wanted to ask a few of you, starting with Dmitri, of your top cybersecurity policy priorities for the coming year. And in your mind, which of these is the most pressing? And does the mounting tension between Russia and Ukraine change your priorities at all?
Well, as we've talked about, I think the cryptocurrency actions, and particularly the use of sanction threat against exchanges that do not do KYC and ML is a really important one. I think there's more that the United States can do to reorganize its government better for defense, particularly given CISA more authorities to do defense broadly across civilian federal government. And obviously, as Rob and Tonya have mentioned, this incident reporting legislation that's on the Hill right now that hopefully will pass this year to enable reporting to the government and sharing across broader U.S. government, including the F.B.I, is really, really important to give us a situational awareness picture of what's going on. And I do want to make a quick plug for something that has just happened that I think is really a game-changing tool. I want to compliment the Department of Homeland Security and the administration for setting this up. But the Cyber Safety Review Board that Rob Silvers chairs, and I'm honored to be a part of, and Tonya's boss, Brian Vordenan, is a part of as well, I think is really a critical tool to review cyber incidents that have taken place and determine holistically how we can do better as a nation and as a world in responding to future cyber incidents. Learning from past mistakes is really, really critical, and we've just not been doing a good job of it in cyber so far. Great.
Tonya or Rob, I think, Rob, you mentioned earlier some of your top priorities, right, including incident response reporting. How about you, Jaak?
Yeah, hard to pick the top number one
top
thing.
One or two.
Yeah, one or two. Okay, good. We NATO CCD COE is, amongst other things, a training organization, and I feel that the better cyber hygiene is in the broadest amongst the masses of people, of internet users, the harder it is for the cyber criminals and cyber attackers. So training people, training everybody from common user to expert level is what we'll keep on doing. Our exercises train the top cyber defenders. And cyber offense, NATO has come along. We are now, not allergic to the talk of NATO nations exercising cyber offense. It is a tool that needs to be used, and we need to come to the terms that, in accordance with the international law, we need to be ready and emotionally okay with using cyber offense if called upon.
What do you mean by that? Give me an explanation, example.
Well, I'll go back to my previous job as an Estonian air chief. I had a talk with a fellow air chief from a large NATO nation, and he told me that in a theater, dropping a laser-guided bomb on a confirmed ISIS server room is a decision delegated down to a major or lieutenant colonel level, very low tactical. Doing the same with offensive cyber would be, high political level decision. It's not going to come to the equal level in the next year or two, but at least it should be down to the operational commander, the general officer in charge of the overall operation should be able to say that I'm going to use cyber. That's how comfortable we should get. With
in the military realm, right? You're talking about.
Yeah.
Okay, it's interesting. And we have only a couple of minutes left. I wanted to just ask you all about something very interesting that I've seen the U.S. government do in the last few weeks, really. This is cyber related, it's Ukraine related, it's Russia's use of, the cyber realm to conduct its influence operations, its information warfare and disinformation campaigns. And the US government has been aggressively exposing these operations, often declassifying information and intelligence in order to make public what it's seeing about Russian plots, like false flag operations to say stage a fake explosion that takes casualties among ethnic Russians and pinning the blame on Ukraine in order to create a false pretext for an invasion. How unprecedented is that level of sort of counter-information warfare by a Western government? What do you think of it? How effective is it?
It's been remarkable to watch this over the last few weeks, Ellen, because it's not just happening, of course, in cyber. They're publicizing all sorts of intelligence about Russian troop buildup, about decision-making that's taking place in the Kremlin with regards to potential invasion. And I really have to commend the administration because they're clearly deciding to go all in on their attempt to stop this war and potentially change Russia's calculus by letting them know just how much we know about what they're trying to do. Unclear if that will actually make a difference for Putin, but it's certainly worth a try, and it certainly is remarkable to watch the level of intelligence that we are actually able to assemble on Russia's intentions, on Russia's capabilities across the board in this upcoming conflict.
Jaak?
I agree with Dmitri. We're learning that Russia and accepting that Russia in the past decade has been better than us, and now we, the West, need to catch up and to do information warfare as good as they are.
Okay. Rob or Tonya, do you have any thoughts on the counter-information, disinformation campaign the U.S. is carrying out?
Yes. Information manipulation is an early chapter in Russia's conflict playbook. And we're not going to cede the information environment to Russia in areas where it matters to us. And I think what you've seen is, frankly, an unprecedented campaign by this administration to correct the record and make sure that information, accurate information, is out there to correct the misinformation that Russia spews out in pursuit of its objectives. And you've seen that in terms of the releases of Russia's plans and intentions. I think you've also seen it with some terrific work that our State Department has done by issuing a rumor control website to counter some of the more flagrant Russian propaganda as to who is really responsible for the escalating situation in Ukraine. I think you can expect to see all of that continue and just rev up. We're committed to that line of effort as an administration.
Well, that's all the time we have for our panel. Want to thank the Munich Cybersecurity Conference for giving us this platform to share our thoughts, and to thank you all for watching. Thanks again, everyone.